If Americans have been more productive, shouldn't that mean more money in Americans' wallets? Ever heard the expression, a rising tide raises all boats? Not just the yachts, but the dinghies and canoes and everything in between? Well, it used to be that the rising tide of America's economic prosperity meant that all Americans, regardless of class, saw their incomes rise by about the same rate. At least, this was the case from 1947 to 1979. Over the past 30 years, since 1979, Americans have been increasingly productive. Check out this graph. The blue line is worker productivity. See? It's been increasing steadily. The red line is median family income, adjusted for inflation. You can see that from 1947 to 1979, the rising tide did result in rising incomes for median income families. But then something happened. Starting around 1979, working families' incomes no longer rose with their increasing productivity. Not only did the rising tide fail to raise all boats, the poorest Americans actually sank, earning less money than they did in 1979. Overall, the average worker only saw a 10% increase in their hourly wage, even though they had an 80% increase in their productivity. Almost all of the gains in income earned by workers in the past 30 years have gone to the very top. What if all of that new income had been distributed so that families saw their incomes rise at the same rates, regardless of class? Would that have made a difference? You bet. Every year, middle-class families would have $10,000 more in their wallets than they do now. The lowest income Americans would have an extra $5,700 to pay the bills with. Still not convinced of the growing income inequality? Look at CEOs. In 1979, they made about 35 times as much as the average worker. Now, they earn over 185 times as much. And the gap between executive pay and average production worker pay was even bigger right before the Great Recession. In 2007, CEOs earned an average of 300 times as much as average workers. Remember, at the same time that wages have stagnated and the inequality has been expanding, workers have actually been more productive. So there's all this extra stuff being made. Who's buying it? We are. How? Debt. Debt is compensating for this gap. It is at least part of the reason we aren't noticing the increasing inequality. We may live in houses, drive cars, and get an education, but we don't own those things. The reality is that 90% of us aren't getting our fair share of the income. We may not notice it all the time because we can count on credit, and goodness knows do we use it. This is costing us. We have more debt as families and individuals than we ever have before. Here we see the amount of debt American households have been experiencing since 1946. By 2007, Americans had more debt than they had money to spend. In fact, families borrowed 40% more than they made in a year. Don't take my word for it, ask your family members. Chances are that the older generations will remember a time when credit cards were less common and rarely used. Though we may be used to it, there is a problem. Debt hides the fact that 90% of Americans are earning less money than they did in 1979 and suffering from more inequality.